Welcome back to Combat Mission, where we're going to take a look at the theory behind machine gun fire. This is all about exploiting ballistics for tactical effect. We're in Final Blitzkrieg for this one, and we're using an MG42 in the tripod-mounted heavy machine gun role because it's pretty obvious where the bullets are going. But this all obviously also applies to other combat mission titles and any projectile weapon, not just MGs, though the fine details might differ a little. So, we've got our MG, and our job is to stop the Americans crossing the river at this bridge. To do this, we've set up on the top floor of one of these buildings where we have a great field of fire and an elevated position high up on this slope. Soon, a US rifle platoon leaves the tree line across the river. Our MG spots them, opens fire, and misses with every burst. Some of the Americans are suppressed, some of them have decided to speed up, but on the first turn none of them are actually hit. On the next turn, our MG inflicts some casualties, but only two, and worse, with two different bursts. Firing at enemy infantry casually walking across open ground and only managing to cause 2 casualties in 2 minutes is not the kind of performance you might expect from a weapon with the MG42's reputation. So what's going on? What's going on is ballistics. When we fire a bullet, it doesn't travel in a straight line. It travels in an arc because gravity drags it down towards the earth. Our MG here has a pretty tall arc. It's not only firing at fairly long range, about 600 or 700 meters, it's also firing from an elevated position. This means that there's a very limited part of the bullet's trajectory that actually has a chance of hitting any targets. The only dangerous area along the whole of the arc is right at the end. This area is called the beaten zone. It's usually oval in shape because recoil means that there are more vertical forces on the weapon than horizontal forces. Being in the beaten zone of a machine gun is a good way to start a new and exciting career as a colander. The problem for our machine gun is that the ballistics of this position create a very small beaten zone. Because we're so high up and firing at range, we're firing at a high trajectory. It means the bullets are falling into the beaten zone at a relatively steep angle, giving us a very squashed oval that is not only unlikely to cover more than one enemy infantryman, but also needs the gunner to be very accurate if he wants to actually hit anything. The technical name for this is plunging fire because the bullets are dropping into the beaten zone. It has its uses. For example, if we were attacking, we could use it to fire over the heads of our own forces without fear of hitting them, or if we were wanting to engage a discrete point target, but it's not what we're looking for here. So what can we do to make our MG42 more effective? A big part of the problem here is that tall arc of fire. That's what's making the beaten zone so small. So let's take our MG out of the building and move it down towards the riverbank. This is going to do 2 things. First, we're losing height, so obviously we're not shooting downwards, and second, we're moving closer. This means that the gunner doesn't have to aim upwards to extend the range of the weapon. Between getting closer to the ground and decreasing the range, we've significantly flattened the trajectory for our machine gun fire. The result of this, as the Americans exit the tree line again, is that our MG quickly starts inflicting casualties. To some degree, this is because we're now at 300 meters, making the enemy soldiers easier targets, and leading the MG42 gunner's TAC AI to fire longer bursts more frequently. But it's also because by changing the arc of fire, we've increased our machine gun's area of effect. By flattening the firing arc, we've changed the shape of the beaten zone. We've changed it from short and fat to long and thin. We've also increased the amount of danger space in the trajectory. Danger space, or inevitably the danger zone, is anywhere along the trajectory where we might hit a target. When we were up in the house engaging in plunging fire, the only danger space was in the beaten zone. Now that we've flattened the arc, the beaten zone might be 100 meters away off in the woods, but depending on the point of aim and the ground, the bullet stream could still cause casualties before it gets there. This is an obvious improvement. But we've still only hit 2 enemy soldiers, and because our MG team is much closer and not well concealed inside a building, the Americans have spotted it by the end of the turn. It doesn't take long for the enemy platoon to pin down our machine gun. That's not ideal, so what can we do about it? One of the problems here is the enemy formation. The Americans are spread out, advancing on us in extended line. Our MG is engaging in frontal fire. It's firing at the enemy head on. And from here, the long, narrow area of the beaten zone is never going to cover more than 1 or 2 targets. It's also inefficient because from the gunner's perspective, the enemy infantry occupies a wide angle of arc and he has to traverse a lot to shift his point of aim around that arc. What we really want to do is match the beaten zone to the long axis of the enemy formation, so each burst has a good chance of hitting multiple targets. To do this, we can move our MG42 across the river near the viaduct where it's at 90 degrees to the enemy advance, and we can engage in flanking instead of frontal fire. This time, when the enemy platoon appears and our machine gun opens up, we quickly start inflicting heavy casualties. If the gunner misses the target he's aiming at, the burst has plenty more enemy soldiers along its trajectory that it might hit. There are some important things going on here. The first is that this kind of fire, when our line of fire corresponds to the long axis of the target, is called Enfilade fire, and it is extremely effective. Not only because, as we've seen, we can hit multiple soldiers with each burst, but because the enemy infantry is contained within a very small angle, and the gunner doesn't need to traverse very much, so he can switch between targets very quickly and get more lead downrange. Secondly, from this position, the trajectory of the MG42's bullet stream almost parallels the ground where the enemy is. It's zipping through the American platoon at knee height. This is called grazing fire because it's practically cutting the grass, and it's the opposite of plunging fire. Again, it's much more effective because we have more danger space. The line of fire is lethal along the whole area where it's intersecting with the target formation here. Third, we've not only inflicted heavier casualties, 12 in the first minute, but the enemy have taken these casualties in a very short space of time and suffered a morale shock. This has a much more drastic effect than a steady drip of losses. By the end of the turn, all of the surviving enemy soldiers are pinned down, some of them are panicking, the rest are shaken, and the platoon is out of control. So not only are they not a threat for the immediate future, but they're trapped in place, and if we have some maneuver elements or mortars on hand, we should be able to finish them off pretty quickly. So enfilading grazing fire is the most effective type of fire your machine guns can put out, but it usually comes with some trade-offs. The most important of these is how our machine gun position relates to the terrain. The lower we get to the ground, the more we restrict our fire because changes in elevation, woods and buildings start obstructing line of sight. For example, if the enemy decided to advance on the other side of the road, they would be invisible behind the road embankment and they'd be able to get right past us in a way that they couldn't if we were back up in the house. These areas that the machine gun can't see or engage along its line of fire are examples of dead ground. From a defensive point of view, we want to minimize these areas and cover them with other units or indirect fire weapons like mortars. When we're attacking, we want to exploit areas of dead ground to get forward without getting massacred. So sighting our MG for flanking grazing fire usually costs us some flexibility. If the enemy isn't considerate enough to walk into our field of fire, then it's going to be difficult for the MG to have an effect on the battle unless it moves. It's also worth pointing out here that our MG42 team is seriously exposed where it is. If the enemy rolled a tank forward instead of infantry, or if he attacked through the woods on top of the MG position, then they're going to have a really bad day. That then is a really quick look at the theory behind machine gun fire. We've got the beaten zone and danger space, and we've got plunging, grazing and enfilade fire. Knowing all the definitions and what's called what isn't as important as understanding the relationships between your firing position, the ground, and the enemy. The key skill here is being able to look at the terrain and see how engagements might play out in advance. Once you've got a grip on how the ballistics work, this is a lot easier, and spotting opportunities for maximising the effects of certain weapons really helps drive that all-important terrain analysis, whether you're trying to inflict casualties on the enemy or whether you're trying to avoid suffering them yourself. Hope you'll find this one useful and interesting. I'll catch you in the next video.